Profitability Index, or PI, is the last measure we need to discuss in terms of evaluating capital projects. To obtain it, we divide the present value of a project's future cash flows by the initial investment. As we can see, the measure is closely related to the net present value. That's why the PI can be expressed using the NPV. We add 1 to the ratio between NPV and initial investment, and voila! We've got another way to obtain the probability index. As we examined earlier, the NPV is the difference between the present value of future cash flows and the initial investment. On the other hand, the profitability index is a ratio. It measures the so-called bang for your buck, that is, the value created in terms of NPV per dollar invested. So, if a project costs $100 and the present value of its future cash flows is $120, the profitability index value would be $120 divided by $100, which is 1.20. Please notice that the NPV for this investment is positive, $20, which means that it is a desirable investment. In general, if a project has a positive NPV, the present value of the future cash flows is bigger than the initial investment. The profitability index would thus be greater than 1 for a positive NPV investment and less than 1 for a negative NPV investment. This leads us to infer that we should invest in projects that have a PI greater than 1 and reject those that produce a ratio of less than 1. This is the rule we should follow regarding investments. To illustrate its rationale, let's go to the previous example with Alpha. As you remember, the company made an initial investment of $150 million, which produced a net present value of $27.19 million. The present value of its cash inflows for 3 years was $177.19 million. By substituting the parameters we know, we obtain the following. The present value of the future cash flows is divided by the initial investment to reach a ratio of 1.18. Of course, we could also use the derivation of this formula by dividing the ratio of NPV to the initial investment and then adding 1 to the result. In the end, we obtain the same ratio of 1.18. See what we did here? We essentially calculated the value we received in exchange for the investment of $1. That's why the profitability index is often referred to as a benefit-to-cost ratio. Since the result is higher than 1, we infer that Alpha should invest in the project based on the PI rule regarding investment decision-making. All right, before we wrap up the topic, let's examine the advantages and disadvantages of using the PI measure. As we saw earlier, this is a quite straightforward approach that is easy to understand and communicate. Since it's closely related to the NPV rule, this measure accounts for the time value of money and in most cases results in decisions which are consistent with the IRR and the NPV. In addition, the profitability index is often used as a guide in capital rationing. When capital is scarce, it makes sense to allocate it to the projects with the highest PI, as it measures the value created per dollar invested. That's why governments and NGOs use this index when performing capital analysis. They would like to use their limited funding in the most effective way. Nevertheless, PI has certain drawbacks. Consider an investment that costs $10 and has a $20 present value, and another investment that costs $1,000 with a $1,500 present value. The first one has an NPV of $10 and a PI of 2. The second investment has an NPV of $500 and a PI of 1.50. If these are mutually exclusive investments, then the second one is preferable, even though it has a lower PI. The PI measure can be misleading when used as a standalone investment decision criterion. That's why in reality, it is frequently used in combination with NPV and IRR. Good job! We've come a long way. So far, we have covered all the major tools used in investment decision-making.